In today's deeply polarized world, disagreeing about politics can feel like more than a difference of opinion. It can feel like living in two different realities. In today's episode, a radical experiment to see the world through the eyes of someone on the other side of the political divide. And a question for all of us: how can we stay curious and connected when all our news feeds and algorithms are designed to let us stick with what's comfortable and vilify what we don't understand?
Most of us were given a cookie-cutter template for how to live, love, and succeed. But what if you don't fit that mold? What if you're ready to live a little differently, even if that makes you the odd one out?
We're Nyla and Cole, two people questioning the systems, the stories, and the identities that shape us. From politics to pleasure, culture to connection, this is where taboo meets truth.
If you've ever felt like a black sheep, cycle breaker, or someone who doesn't quite fit the cookie-cutter mold, then you're a deviant just like us.
So this is a really fascinating subject, and one that I feel like I've been stumbling upon a few times in recent months and years. This idea that we can get on with people in our community, with friends, family members, dates. We can get on so many levels, and yet there can be one thing that feels so deeply polarizing in how we think about the world, or what we think is acceptable or normal. And it can be hard to know what to do with that, especially when it feels like such a big part of your identity. So for me, these are things often connected to my human values, right? Like human rights, equal rights for everybody. But equally, I feel really challenged by friends who haven't had a lot of curiosity to interrogate stories we've been fed about wars in the world, particularly the wars that we are so complicit in, like the war between Israel and Palestine, and the number of casualties that under the age of 18 and even under the age of 5, for me, there's something really visceral that kicks off. And to have some friends explain it away as just geopolitics and what has to happen, I go back to something really deep inside, which is like, where is your humanity? And why can you explain away the deaths of children? So yeah, a couple of zingers to kick us off there,
Yeah, just some light topics.
But I know that you and I have had these conversations for a long time, but you have kind of branched off into a separate experiment, which I think is super fascinating. And I'm excited that we get to tell our listeners about that today. And I want to kind of commend you on it from a personal level, because I think it introduces so much personal challenge to do an experiment like this. So before I go on, please share a little bit about what this experiment has been and maybe what your motivations were for kicking this off.
Yeah, thank you. So I've got one brother, and we really like each other. I mean, we get on, we value having a brother. Whenever we're together, we have a lot of fun together. But man, for two people who were both raised in a moderate Christian family in Colorado, we could not be more different. It was always apparent. I mean, I was the nerd. He was the jock. He was the numbers finance person. I was like the crosswords person. So I guess it was also no one's surprise that we really went to different sides of the political spectrum. For the most part, that was never a big issue until, I suppose, the last decade or so, when I think we can all agree the world started to get very, very polarized. And when it just started to get more and more difficult to even understand how anyone on the opposite side of the aisle could think and act the way they do. And it's gotten emotional, it's gotten frustrating, it's gotten ugly. I mean, ever since Trump's first election in 2016, my brother and I just haven't even been able to discuss politics. It's just been understood this is a no-go zone, because every time we've even tried, tensions have flared and things have gotten a bit ugly.
Yeah, I guess that makes Christmas dinner interesting.
You just sweep it under the rug and you let these resentments and frustrations boil. But then about a year and a half ago, I got this idea for an experiment. It came one day when I was spending a few weeks in Berlin, and my brother called me up and he said, "Hey, all the news I'm reading is talking about these hordes of refugees swarming the streets of Germany, rioting and causing chaos. Like, is that happening where you are? Are you okay?"
Wow.
And I remember looking out my window. It was this quiet day. The birds were chirping. And I was like, not where I am. Maybe that's going on somewhere else, but that is not my reality. And he says, okay, good. I was a little worried that the news I was reading was telling me an exaggerated version of things. And it became really clear to both of us that the different corners of the internet we both live in, the separate algorithms, the news feeds that we doom scroll through are presenting two completely different versions of the world. And it was almost like he and I were talking to each other from different realities.
I just want to shout that out for a second, because I think what you just shared there actually shows something quite unique. Like, most of us are influenced by our algorithms, but most of us don't know it, or we don't consciously bring awareness to it, right? The fact that in some ways he was fact checking his news with you. You know, he reached out and he said, is this for real? Rather than being like, of course it is. It's on the internet. It's on Fox News. So
exactly,
give him credit for having curiosity to want to put in the effort, even just to text you and ask you that.
That's it. I really respect him for doing that and for starting to question how much of a slant and how much credibility to give his feed. And it was actually a bit of a wake-up call for me, because how often do I do that? I mean, I think where I'm sitting further on the left, we're a bit smug about valuing the truth more or valuing the facts. But how often have I actually paused to think, am I getting the full picture? Am I only seeing one version of this story? Am I being told certain things and not being told others? So it was actually a bit of a wake-up call for me. So fast forward to Trump getting elected for a second term, even though all the polling was saying that wasn't going to happen. And I've really started to question, like, this does not align with my understanding of the world. What am I missing? Why did half of the country think this was a good idea? What perspectives, what narratives are just not even on my radar? So I called my brother up and I said, okay, humor me here. I've got this crazy idea. What if for a couple of weeks, we just swap realities? What if we swap the news we consume, swap the algorithms we read, and just try to experience the world through each other's eyes?
Such a cool idea, honestly. I don't know how you thought of that, but it's also just, I can't imagine if you had totally appreciated like how much effort that was going to be at that time, because it feels a bit scary to totally, I find some comfort in my own sources, you know, and I guess that's exactly the point.
And I think that's such an important point for most of us, including myself. We go to the news hoping to see things that confirm what we already think. We seek out that confirmation. We want to read stories that assure us that we're the good guys and that confirm that the bad guys are up to no good. And that's unfortunately the reason a lot of us turn to the news. And if I was going to try to connect with my brother and connect to the other half of the country, I decided I might need to take a break from that.
Yeah, it's so interesting, actually, that even as, you know, smart, educated individuals, we do seek a simpler narrative, just because otherwise it takes so much more effort to digest the news and to be up to date with the news and, you know, to understand the multiple complexities and the nuances. And perhaps you can do that for one subject or one war, but holding that level of complexity around all topics just feels too much. And so we do look for the simplistic, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy kind of narrative.
Yeah, we live in a chaotic world and we desperately want it to make sense. So we seek out the simplest versions of things to help us breathe easy. But I think a lot of those times, those narratives can be simplified to our detriment, can be simplified at the expense of the truth, frankly, and just the complex gray that is unfortunately the reality that we live in.
Well, and in many ways, that's mature space for people to manipulate, right? In many ways, it's like if somebody wants to then help skew the way that people think, then that's exactly the way to do it. So, I mean, let's get into that in a bit, but tell me, what was Joe's reaction when you suggested this idea to him?
I mean, I thought he was going to shoot me down, frankly, but for whatever reason, he agreed to it. A lot of his frustration was just election fatigue. Like, he was reading mostly Fox News, and he was just sick of being told that the only story in the world was U.S. elections, and he wanted a broader view. That's
really interesting, actually, because this kind of speaks to, like, almost being overfed. Like, Fox News maybe have overdone the election news to the point where he's now starting to step back from it. It's not engaging him as much as it was before.
He recognized that opening Fox News and the front line being about how many days Biden was going to play golf, or what Kamala Harris said 15 years ago on Twitter, he was realizing that this is not maybe what we should be prioritizing. He's a busy guy. He's a business owner and a father of 3, and he wanted to get straight to the most pressing matters. And I really respect his motivation to break out of those habits of just being spoon-fed sort of this comfort news and trying to get to the truths that matter. And so I was really glad he had that motivation for sure.
Yeah, and that's actually a great space to be curious about, like, what else is out there, right?
Another big motivation for both of us is that we rarely have the opportunities to have respectful conversations about the news with people who disagree with us. I mean, I'm a bit ashamed to say that almost my entire social circle aligns with me politically. And I even told him, I'm glad that because you're my brother, I now have one conservative person in my life. And I wish my social circle were more diverse, but he was the only person I could talk to about this. Right. And he said something really interesting. Actually, maybe I'll just play a clip where he explains that himself. But he's always felt a pretty extreme pressure not to pipe up with his own opinions because he's felt such a strong... He's just never felt like disagreeing with progressive politics is even welcome. I'll just let him explain that himself from a clip from one of our conversations. How often do you actually discuss the news? And how often do you interact with people with different political views?
Well, I rarely have substantial conversations with people about political views, really at all. While I've always leaned relatively and maybe heavily right, I've always lived in blue cities my entire life. So whether it was Flagstaff, Austin, or Jackson, I've always lived in blue cities, and therefore have not really ever felt in the safest of places to throw out my views.
And that's so interesting because here I'm thinking, oh, my brother's lived in Texas and Wyoming. He's in red states. He's surrounded by other right-wingers, but
it's never felt that way.
I made. Yeah,
yep.
Because I didn't think about your actual communities.
I've always felt like the minority, and yeah, I haven't been on the other side of that as far as my direct town. So,
and I wonder how many people actually feel that way. I mean, I totally understand that. I sometimes also feel like I'm surrounded by people with different views. But that's probably always true and always not true for a lot of Americans, depending on how you slice it. And I wonder how often we feel like we're around people who don't agree with us, and then we're sort of discouraged to speak up because people won't respect our beliefs. You know, maybe we're all convinced that we're the minority because we are always in some different ways too. And we don't actually ever feel safe talking about these things.
No, it makes sense.
So yeah, my brother amazingly agreed to do this. And what's even more cool, he agreed for us to record our conversations. You can listen. We've had 3 conversations so far, and you can listen to all 3 of them. They're just a podcast mini-series, and we'll include the link to listen to those in the description of this episode.
News Swap, right? That's what it's called?
News Swap is the name of the series.
Okay, wow. So how did you even begin? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of topics where you would have naturally clashed. So, like, how do you set something like this up?
Yeah, so we had one conversation before making the swap, and we did it just to lay it all out there because we hadn't even talked politics in a decade, and really just do an exercise in, I guess, radical listening, I want to call it. Like we did this thing where we just took turns saying to each other, how the heck could anyone think X? Like I asked him, how the heck could anyone think that the election was stolen in 2020? And then he gave me an answer, and I just sat there and listened, and I didn't respond to it.
Didn't you ask him, how the heck can someone think Trump is a good guy? Something like that.
Absolutely, I did. Do you think he's a good person? My brother's like, yeah, he's a little cringe. But he said something like, he didn't have to run for president because he was rich enough, but he ran 3 times because he wants to make the country better.
Yeah. He's forgiving of, I guess, the style because the vision is maybe aligned with what he thinks is where we need to go. I also found the conversation about wokeness really interesting in that first episode. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, because we took turns at trying to define each other's political bent. Like, we've never talked about this, but what do you think of my politics?
Yeah.
Here's a clip of that. What does woke mean to you? Have you ever thought of me as your woke brother?
Ooh, okay. No, this is a good one. Woke to me, without thinking about it for more than 3 seconds, means that someone is so focused on either a progressive agenda or has the blinders on so hard, focusing on maybe a couple topics, that they are blinded to a lot of other factors around them. I think that's what I'll go with for now.
I love hearing that definition. It actually gives me a lot to think about.
What does woke mean for you?
Well,
is it a word that liberals don't even want to?
Yeah, pretty soon after I heard the word, I don't know if it was a decade ago, once I heard the word being floated around by liberals, I was like, I'm not a fan of this, because the way I interpreted it is like, woke people get it. Like, we get all the problems with the world and we are speaking up about it. And my definition of progressive is knowing that we haven't fixed everything yet and knowing that there's a lot we don't even understand. For me, being liberal is like acknowledging that we all have a lot more to learn and that the world is always changing. And so to call ourselves woke as if we're the only ones who get it sounds very smug and self-righteous. And I think that is why the right seized on it, because it came off as smug and self-righteous. And I don't blame the right for doing that, because I don't like it whenever the left sounds sanctimonious, like they know all the answers.
Fair enough.
So what was really interesting about this is that I think what you did with that first episode was you created the conditions to have a respectful dialogue where you knew there was going to be some difficult conversations that might come up. And one of the things I've learned in my own training around dialogue and negotiation and persuasion is that you begin with where you agree, right? Before you move to what you disagree with, because what you're doing is you're allowing each other to recognize we both believe in, the principles of humanity. And then we layer on top of that the things that perhaps we don't believe in, but we're curious and interested enough to understand how you got there. We're not here to change your mind, right?
That was it. We both agreed this is not about debate. This is about just trying to see if we can respect where each other's coming from and trying to understand each other's values and understanding of the world. Which just felt impossible,
Yeah, seeking to understand that other person's reality. I love it.
So then we kicked off. We tried to go for 3 weeks with nothing but each other's news. My brother read the New York Times and The Economist, this snooty coastal media.
That's what they call it.
Sure. I mean, that's what they call it in conservative media. And I suppressed my gag reflex and consumed Fox News. And
holy shit.
Also got the login details to my brother's X feed, Twitter feed. It still pains me every time to say X. Let's just call it Twitter.
Yeah.
And then I was listening to some podcasts, like the Ben Shapiro podcast. We both admitted already like cheating on day one, just because it's so tempting. You just want that candy. I call it like candy, when you just need that reassurance that the world out there makes some sense based on your values, and that, the villains are being villainous, the good guys are being good guys. Because it was really, really confronting to have good and bad flipped on their head, turned upside down.
Yeah, like withdrawal symptoms or something.
No, I think we both experienced that.
So was the agreement that you weren't allowed to check in on your own news sources? And for how long did you have to each other's?
We went raw dogging. We were not allowed to look at any other news. We lasted 3 weeks.
Okay.
And I've read so much about immigrants committing crimes.
This must have been fascinating for you. I guess you're hearing perhaps all of the opposite stories about things like the economy and immigration and the health system. What was really standing out for you?
Well, one thing that we both agreed on when we met up for our second conversation was not so much that our news sources lie to us, but just they focus on completely different things. I mean, I was suddenly getting a very heavy diet of violent crime, immigration fraud.
Yeah.
And I would have never heard about any of these stories in my media, not because they're untrue, just because the left doesn't focus on them. And not because they're not happening, but because they're not part of any narratives that I turn to the news to have reinforced for me.
Yeah, it's essentially like you're cherry picking the things that help boost your perspective or your narrative, right? And then you just repeat over and over as many stories about that as possible. And it's true, right? Repetition does reinforce in our brains.
Oh, yeah.
So,
and of course, my brother was seeing a lot more about police brutality,
right,
about injustices towards minorities, immigrants, LGBT people. And it was just an exercise, I think, for both of us in realizing that, first of all, that for any of us who are trying to lead busy lives, it's impossible to be following every current event. But I think more to the point, that news we choose to read will give us the news in packaged narratives that we have no say in.
Right.
I don't choose what narratives I want to be fed by the New York Times. He didn't choose what narratives he wanted to get from Fox News. But when they're reinforced over and over again, we very much take them on ourselves. right? They just become part of our reality.
Exactly. It reminds me of Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk about how she talks about the power of a single story, right?
I love her.
She's amazing. And particularly the way that she talks about how when we are, especially in this algorithmic world, we perceive people and places through only one narrative. It kind of leads to these harmful stereotypes and misunderstandings. And we lose like the whole picture. And I guess this is what our algorithms are doing to us, right? Like they're feeding outrage and sensationalism, and let's say it loud, and make it visceral.
Yeah. And then that means that the villains in those narratives just continue to be vilified. And I think the worst part, I think both my brother and I realized this, that the villains also just become the other side of the political aisle.
Right.
I mean, when there's so many stories about what the left is doing and what the right is doing, then half the country becomes vilified in the news sources that you're reading. I mean, for me, it was,
oh my gosh.
I mean, don't get me started on how Fox News actively tries to make its readers loathe the left.
Well, can we play that clip from Michelle Obama? That was that was a moment. Let's play it and then I'll tell you what I think.
So I asked my brother about one particular story I read in Fox News. And this was the month before Trump was sworn into office for the second term. So just one last thing on Fox News headlines. Okay. I was going to share this one that really tickled me, and maybe you have a response to it. It was top story of the day. The headline was, Michelle Obama sparks backlash after posting Happy Holidays video. And I clicked, and it talked about how she'd posted this video, and the backlash was because she had said, I quote, "I know it's been a difficult few months for many of us, and that folks are feeling a little bit anxious and uncertain." And I couldn't even understand. It's like, well, of course, a Democrat has had a difficult few months since a Republican was elected president, and she's posting a video saying that's difficult. But the Fox News headline is she sparks backlash for her video. And I don't even see what the problem is with that video. Am I missing something?
Well, I would imagine, and this is just without seeing that article, because I was in the other world at that point, right? But I think that conservatives are so tired and exhausted from the last 4 years. Like, for us, it just feels like we've been through our gauntlet of just all the, not to get into the debate or too much of it all.
Yeah, it's been a rough 4 years if you're a Republican.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we feel like it's been a rough enough 4 years, always being told that we're wrong and we're the stupid ones, the uneducated that can't comprehend bigger visions and problems and more intellectual things. So to see Democrats now mourning for 2 months, which I know it's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a big shift. A lot happened. But I think that's probably the contrast of it is we've had our time. We got through it. You can handle it too. But again, this is me not seeing the article.
That's a good point. I think we can also admit it's probably an amount of schadenfreude. I bet some readers were sort of laughing at her like, oh, Michelle, you don't even know. We love to have an enemy like AOC or Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yeah. And if Marjorie Taylor Greene has a bad day,
everyone knows. I bet
a lot of people are going to be like celebrating it over in the liberal media.
Yes.
Like, saying deal with it, Marjorie, which is not very civil or very kind.
But it's all over the place on both sides. I mean, I don't think we're surprised to see that anymore.
I mean, I'm sorry, Joe, but it seems a bit childish to me to be like, look, guys, we did our time and now it's your turn. Seriously, is that like how playground politics has become, that we are just, it's just tit for tat. It doesn't seem very adult.
Oh, it's so absurd to me. I think what I did hear from Joe trying to justify this news story is when we have become so polarized and when every narrative, there's a good guy and a bad guy, you feel like if you didn't vote for the guy in office for that whole term, you're made to feel like the bad guy. You might have a sense of retribution or a chance to even the scales. And then suddenly politics isn't even about issues anymore. It's just about these emotional scores to settle. And he said multiple times in our discussions that he just felt shamed for being on the wrong side of politics. And I think that's something worth listening to.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that, right? I mean, as a British person looking at American politics, I've always been quite shocked about how much of the narrative just becomes at making personal digs at each other.
Totally. No.
And in many ways, in the UK, at least you can look up the manifesto and what parties stand for and what policies they're pushing. I feel like so much of American politics, at least for an outsider looking in, is very much hinging on that person being an amazing orator, an amazing kind of leader figure in a very traditional sense, right? Whatever we think a leader looks like. And it's all about their reputation, like how much dirt can be flung at this person, and like damage control and reputation politics. And so much of it is about PR. You know, look at Donald Trump and all of the things that he's accused of. And yet there is enough good PR out there that people are willing to overlook quite serious accusations and I mean, convictions.
I think that's such an interesting take from across the pond. Of course, the U.S. is often called the most individualistic country on the planet. And also just the design of our politics is about, and we don't have a parliamentary system, so we vote on individuals rather than parties. And then it just becomes personal, and it becomes about a cult of personality.
But it's also interesting how, like, in America, people believe in being, I know it's a two-party system right now, which is, you know, in many ways we're stuck in a
fish.
Right. And we're kind of stuck in similar vibes, although that's maybe shifting now. But this idea that if you've always voted Republican or you've always voted Democrat, it's almost like a religious identity that people hold. It's part of their identity of like what state they're from.
And I do think it's a really interesting observation. I don't think it was like that to the degree that it is until the last 10, 12 years, maybe in the last decade or two. I go to other countries, you know, I'm talking to you from Australia right now, and they really pride themselves on being able to have political discussions at the family dinner where people are on opposite sides of the spectrum, and you just sort of shrug it off because the gap is quite minimal for one thing, and the opposing sides have not been turned into mortal enemies by the discourse, but you're allowed to disagree without it being a stain on a person's character.
Mm-hmm. So there's a juicy part in, I think, episode 2 that I'd love to pick up with you, right? So it was the part where your brother talks about his X feed, and I think you asked him about the number of disturbing images you saw of, was it women and children being killed or hurt in Gaza, and how that was posted all over his feed, almost as a celebration of victory in some ways. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I struggled with the X feed so much more than Fox News. Fox was just comedy compared to what was going on that X feed. And I know it really got to you too. When I first opened my brother's X feed, I was just bombarded with post after post celebrating the deaths of Gazan civilians. And it was, my first thought was like, this isn't who my brother is. He does not celebrate anyone's deaths. But why is this all that he's seeing? Oh, it was dark. And I really wrestled with even whether or not to bring it up with him, because the point of this whole experiment was about mutual respect, but I couldn't respect this. So I did confront him about it. And well, first of all, he agreed with me that this is not anything worth celebrating. And he also said he didn't even want to see these types of posts. He does have, let's just say, different opinions about the Israeli-Gazan conflict than I do, but he doesn't want to see these posts celebrating civilian deaths. And it prompted a really interesting conversation about algorithms and how algorithms are probably even more to blame than traditional news outlets for this polarization we're seeing. And I'll just let him explain how he thinks this happened.
What drove me to Twitter was I was shocked that there was such an important, we'll just call it, that's not picking sides. I'm just saying this is an important event in the world. There's big things happening. And I was shocked that I couldn't find any major news feed that was talking about updates. And this is right when the war was in the heat of it. You know, are they working their way west or south? There was action, happening. And Fox wasn't reporting updates. I don't know if I was really going to CNN, but I was going to Be Independent, which I thought was kind of maybe a more independent news source. I was going to the BBC, trying to find some news. And I was just shocked how little news there was for this massive war that has the whole world's attention. So that was one of the things that really kind of drove me to, all right, what's going on out there? So I don't know if it was before or after my Denver Broncos search on Twitter, but actually I think I started with the Ukraine war, but then searching up the Israeli war. And for me, I went to Israeli, like I looked up the IDF. Okay, does the IDF have a page? Are they going to report events or what they're doing and so forth? So I didn't go looking for a pro-Palestinian group as far as a Twitter feed. I went to the IDF. I went to, I guess, other things that might have come up in that search. And then from there, I really haven't searched much more, but I have liked posts about either don't forget the hostages or, it's a lot of repercussions of the war, but Hamas started it. Like, without debating the whole thing, I'm just trying to let you know, like, those would be the things that I maybe liked. But I honestly think that's about as far as my searches and likes have gone. And if there's other rougher things that popped up from that, I think that's maybe the I'll just call it the reality of what else could come in from those searches. But I'm not going out looking or liking like Gaza and casualties or anything like that.
So what I think is interesting here is that he clearly came to this with some curiosity, right? He's like, okay, I don't know enough about what's going on with such a huge global conflict. My government, the US government, is sending a lot of aid and weapons and whatnot, support to the Israeli government. Other global governments are also involved in this. It's a major issue, right? So he recognizes it's a huge thing. Yeah. And then he makes a choice to go to the Israeli Defense Force to get his information, right? So this is where I have a challenge, is that he shows one-sided curiosity. I don't know if that really counts as curiosity. That's basically saying, I'm going to look for the narrative that I think is most aligned to me. What I'm curious about, and if Joe were here, what I'd really love to ask him is like, what stopped you from being curious about how it was being reported from a Palestinian perspective and how that might potentially challenge the Israeli perspective? Because this is out and out war now. As an observer, you have the opportunity to say, let me hear you both out and make up my own opinion about what's emerging here. But he didn't show enough curiosity. He just decided to take the narrative that this all began on October 7th. And so that's the bad guy. And to me, that's the single story risk right there.
Yeah. I think a few really interesting things are happening here. He originally went to X because he wanted the facts. He felt like Fox News wasn't focusing enough on this issue, and he wanted on-the-ground sources reporting.
Yeah.
And then he made an error by only going to one side. And I think he brought in his own bias there, thinking that the IDF could tell the whole story and that Palestinian news sources couldn't be trusted. And then from that initial bias, his algorithm took it and ran with it.
Right.
It started feeding him more anti-Palestinian things, more Islamophobic things, until it spun out of control and was giving him things he had never asked for, really ugly things that were just more op-ed than any semblance of the news. And I mean, you and I can sit here condemning my brother's choice, but if we take a step back, like, are there times that you and I might have done something similar, like wanting the full story and then going to one source and thinking we're getting the whole picture?
Yeah, you're right.
You're
right. I mean, probably I'm doing not the opposite, but like in some ways, my own behavior is not miles away from his. I can criticize him for only seeking out one side of the story, but I'm equally not like immersing myself in a lot of Israeli news about this conflict. I'm choosing to stick to sources that I know and trust. But I think I have a bit more awareness that I'm doing that. I don't know, even as I just said that out loud, do I though? Because I do have a very certain opinion about this. But can I just say one more thing? This isn't for me about like, in some ways it's like there's a part of me that wants to be right. Okay, I'll admit there's a part of me that wants to be right. I know that there's more to this story than the Israeli Defense Force would claim, for example. But there's a much bigger part of me that is saying, on a human level, I don't care what story you're going to feed me. On a human level, I'm never going to be okay with the mass killing of under 5-year-olds or children or the targeted killing of children. And there's enough evidence and there's enough sources that suggest that that's even a risk, let alone a certainty. And so for me, what hurts for me the most is when people's empathy disappears in those moments. And I think as a person of color, I would also add that if these were, this is going to be a challenging perspective, but I would add that if these were white kids in America being gunned down or if there were white kids in the UK or anywhere in Western Europe, we would have a much different collective universal reaction to this, I think, than we're having right now. You know, we wouldn't probably be selling the amount of arms that we are to Israel to create a behemoth to take on a group that isn't even considered a state, right? So the point I really want to make is that sometimes it's not about being right. It's about recognizing which human rights need to come first ahead of having the most articulate argument.
I hear you. And it's one thing I love about you for just taking a firm stand on what you know to be true. And I'll be honest with you, I had visceral reactions over and over again to a lot of the topics that came up in these conversations I had with my brother and I. And the question that keeps coming up in my mind is, how can I express to my brother how deeply wrong I think some of his most strongly held beliefs are without it seeming like I'm shaming him for them?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's something that came up for him so many times. He has felt this shame. He has felt the left shaming him for one belief or another. He claims the left is very loud in condemning opinions or statements that they don't agree with. And, you know, I think it's the classic idea that cancel culture has run amok. You know, my brother and I talked a bit about wokeness, and for him, his political ideologies are just reinforced by this feeling that he needs to push back against wokeness and cancel culture. And I think there's something really critical for us to think about there. What has this climate of shaming people for having the wrong opinions, where's that gotten us?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know, right, when somebody feels shamed or vilified in some way, or they don't feel like they're heard or they're validated, that ain't going to get them to engage with you in a way that's helpful or healthy, right? So if we want to be able to come together and not be divided by our algorithms, then we're actually going to need to develop the kind of skills that you both demonstrate on this podcast, frankly, like the skills to be able to actively listen to each other, even when we disagree. And the desire to seek to understand, you know, like Stephen Covey in his famous book talks about this idea of like, let's first seek to understand. Let's understand also what's between the words, right? Or what's underneath the words that people are saying, because we don't want to trigger people's defensiveness where they now need to like double down on an idea that they have just to retain a sense of dignity or self-respect. You know, he says in his clip that he's almost felt like conservatives are considered like dumber and not able to hold these big ideas. We don't want people to feel like they have to shut down to like hold on to a sense of respect. And it really kills trust, right?
Psych study after psych study tells us that trying to shame someone into changing their mind backfires horribly.
Right.
People get defensive, they lash out, they look for new ways to justify their behavior. And my brother actually says this himself. He says, well, it might look like we all agree because you might shame someone into silence, but actually they're just sitting there silent and resentful and developing this deep underground animus towards you and your side of the fence. I think as horrified as a lot of us are with what might be happening with the Trump administration right now, the left has done a really bad job of trying to invite people over to our side of the aisle, because instead we post a really strict set of rules, like you need to think this, and this, or you're wrong. And we're calling out anyone who doesn't agree. But what we should be doing is calling in people and saying, come over to this side where we have sanity and we have respect and we have a desire to understand each other. Maybe have some curiosity about where you're coming from, and we have a desire to tell you about why we think the way we do. Instead, we just shut people down and shame them. And I do think that mindset has a huge role in deepening this divide. I can't just point to Trump and say it's all his fault. Maybe I'll play a quick clip where we talk about this, the way that the sense of gatekeeping can backfire horribly and how it certainly hasn't worked for my brother. I've talked about this with some friends and this sort of new reality of what it's like to be left and what it's like to be right. If you're a conservative and you walk into a party of conservatives who haven't met you and you're like, hey guys, I'm conservative. They're like, cool, grab a beer, let's all hang out. But if you're a liberal who shows up to a liberal party and you're like, hey, I'm liberal, the liberals will be like, prove it. how liberal are you? Are you the right kind of liberal? And just spend the whole time judging you and picking apart like what you're wrong about.
Interesting.
And I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. This like sanctity of being liberal enough that's not doing anyone any favors.
Well, to jump on your party analogy, I mean, the last 4 years, I felt like I was a conservative walking into the Liberal Party because they were the only voices. They were the controlling voices, right? Loud voices. They had the presidency. They had, and I couldn't walk into a party. I'm trying to stick with the analogy here.
You didn't feel welcome at all.
I didn't feel welcome. I couldn't raise my hand and introduce myself because of the judgmental of, you're absolutely wrong. You've always been wrong and this and that. And it's like, all right, I'm just not even going to talk and we're just going to wait. And I think that's how the presidential election felt for a lot of people, right? Because I do feel like the left is loud and vocal. So when there's a voter swing to the right side and it's happening very quietly and the polls are surprised that the numbers are so right because it's just a quiet movement, I think that actually kind of is maybe an example of the conservatives don't want to speak up and raise their hand they're conservative because they're tired of listening to what the left is going to say about them. But yeah, I know that could go both ways at some level, but I think those quiet polling numbers are really almost an example of that.
It's true. And to be honest, I can make similar analogies with like the equalities debate or gender wars and the way that some people see the feminist movement. I think there are so many similar situations with big topics where we're falling into almost these like purity tests, as you described them, where like you're only right if you fit this mold. We only invite you. I mean, you need to be a purist, right? You're either in or you're out, and it's very binary. And I think that by definition is polarizing, right?
Are you familiar with moral foundations theory?
I've heard about it.
So it's a really interesting way of understanding political differences. It basically says that there might be a certain number of values that we all think are important, but we just prioritize differently. Like we might all think that equal opportunity and fairness are important things, but the left prioritizes it way more than the right. Whereas like rule of law and respecting authority, yeah, that's a good thing. But the right is like, no, that's like one of the most important things. But purity is one of the values that's looked at in this moral foundations theory. And for decades, it was considered a conservative value. Conservatives were the ones who were like, you're not pure enough to be conservative. You're a dirty gay person. You're a non-religious person. You're not welcome here. But somehow in the last decade or so, it's switched. Yeah. And the left is seen as like this purity culture where like, are you woke enough? Do you tick all these boxes to be good enough to be counted in the progressive movement? And I think that's really interesting, right?
That is fascinating. And you're right. I wonder how that switched and what that switch was all about, because the right was associated more with like also faith in God and maybe the more traditional setup of how family values shine through. And I think that is maybe less of a factor now. And maybe having someone like Trump at the helm is a huge part of that shift. He's such a disruptor of that narrative in so many ways.
Yeah. I would reason, and my brother would probably agree with this too in a roundabout way, so maybe I'm speaking for him here, but I think we've gotten it in our heads in the last 10 years or so that there's a lot of wind in the sails of progressive ideas. Like the LGBT rights movement had a lot of momentum. Diversity and inclusion had a lot of momentum. And those almost maybe in a lot of the public eye seemed to become the prevailing, like the dominant, dominant idea. And so once, I'm speaking as a queer person, but once people thought that like being pro-LGBT had become the majority opinion, then it was like, we need to condemn the minority for not catching up to us. And so I think when that switched, I think when you feel like you're in the majority of something, then you also feel entitled to judge and shame people who aren't there yet.
Yes.
And I actually think it's a really important issue because everyone's on their own journey. Like when Obama became elected, he wasn't pro-gay marriage. And then he got there. And I'm not going to shame him for being against it at one point. I'm going to salute him for getting there eventually.
Right.
The same way my mom or my dad have come a really long way in the evolution of their thinking about gay rights. but they got there. And it goes back to what I was saying about not calling people out for being where they're at, but calling people in to say, hey, like, it's more fun over here once you realize that, like, gay people aren't terrifying, but like, get on board with us rather than shame on you. And I think that's the big switch that happened.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Cole. That's also helping me process this, because what I hear from you, there's something about pace in there, right? Like the pace at which we all want to go. Like some of us just want to race ahead and go faster because we already know it, you know?
Yeah.
And others aren't quite there yet. And then within that, it's like, instead of feeling defeated by the fact that others aren't quite there yet, it's about regulation. So like, which are the spaces where I can feel accepted and regulated for these views and beliefs, and maybe being a little bit ahead of the curve in like being already aware of these things, whilst also continuing to engage in those spaces so that I can help people see my perspective and invite critique from them as well. It's not about like, I'm always right and so I'm just waiting for them to catch up to me, but it's about like having spaces where I feel accepted so that I don't get to the point of like outrage, and I don't feel like I absolutely lose it because somebody disagrees with me now. But I can recognize that I might need to just draw upon a little bit more listening skill here and a bit more curiosity to understand why somebody holds a view that I completely disagree with. And I have to admit, I do find it hard. I'm not going to lie. I find it so hard because like part of me inside is screaming, being like, how could you? It's like that experiment you had with your brother in the first episode of like, how the heck could anyone think this? Right. I'm going to practice that, actually. Every time I feel activated when someone disagrees with me, I'm going to practice just like ask better questions. I think that would help me. Can I just throw this in there? So like there's this comment that Joe made about feeling like the minority in the blue states. You know, I'm coming back to the first clip we played where he talks about feeling like the minority, right? And as somebody who has lived her life always being the minority, always wherever I've lived or been, identifying as a person that is different, I'm not sure he's totally understood the privilege that he does have in those situations. And I think, for example, when it comes to the gender debates and some of the conversations I've had with people around that is, you know, I agree that sometimes some factions of like the women's movement can be about like hating on men, and some factions of the men's movement is also about hating on women, right? And when you look at that, if that is what your algorithm is feeding you over and over, you're going to think that's what's the reality, that's what's going on as a whole.
That's the dominant take on the other side,
Right. And then at the same time, if you are, you know, if you're a woman and you're seeing all of the stats about the violence against women, the London Metropolitan Police describe the violence against women as an epidemic, right? Like these stats tell a story. And so what I'm noticing is that in all of these examples, somebody has to take the responsibility and the emotional labor of saying, look, I'm the one that feels put upon here. I'm the one that's in the minority, but yet I have to do the extra work of reaching out and not shaming you and not being like, well, all the stats suggest that you guys blah, 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 but instead be like, I'm going to be holier than thou and rise above that and say, despite not having the kinds of privileges that you enjoy as, say, a white man. And by the way, I define privilege as the absence of disadvantage, not as how much money you earn or how wealthy you are. Like you can be a privileged white man, even if you grew up in a very working class environment, even if you don't earn a lot of money today. I think a lot of people confuse this word. It's the absence of disadvantage, right? So a white man in America versus a black man in America, right? The kinds of things you need to think about.
Not any disadvantage at all, but the absence of disadvantage that comes by being a racial minority, for example.
For example, yeah, exactly. And so like, I think there's a missing piece here of like, who's going to take the initiative to bring both sides together in a way that they both feel seen and respected and somewhat validated so that they can have meaningful conversations. Because right now, no one's doing that. And actually, all of our tech, all of our phones, all of our social media profiles are in fact doing the opposite. They're driving us to opposite ends.
I mean, our algorithms are designed to make us, it's called rage bait. They're designed to make us angry at each other. And our news sources are designed to make us angry at each other. And I agree with you. Someone's got to step up and try to offer an alternative way forward. I think doing this is really hard, like staying actively curious and actively open to other people's opinions, especially if any of us have grown up as a minority. And I want to be really clear. I can't tell everyone to go out there and turn the other cheek and have these difficult conversations, because I don't think that's anyone's responsibility. But I do think there's tremendous power in choosing to do that. Mm-hmm. If you have the capacity, the support, the perseverance, the energy to have difficult conversations with people, then I do think that's what has to happen. I think a lot of us, we can't sit around shaming people who try to hate us into finally coming around to our side. Some of us have to do the heavy lifting of calling people in.
Yeah. I think it's also, I hope that we teach this skill to our next generation and we teach it in schools. But I think so much of for kids that are digital native, that grew up with social media or grew up with tech as a huge part of their life, I think there is just different skills that we need to build community in future. Otherwise, we are feeding this loneliness pandemic by isolating ourselves from other people on issues. And when you start to look behind the curtain and realize you've been led down a path because of what some algorithm has chosen to show you, because it's just going to get more hits because it's going to incense you.
Yes. Yeah. That rage bait.
Right? That rage bait. So if you start to understand the incentives at play here and how you're actually being played, it allows you to just step back. And I think in many ways, asking different questions and having curiosity feels a little bit easier than having to, for every news story, go and fact check or go and look at both sides. And, somebody said to me once, there are 3 sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Great.
And I was like, what do I do with this? I don't I don't know. Where do I find the truth? That's the one I want. But choosing to actively expose yourself to different viewpoints, I think, is just a much healthier way to inform yourself and to continue growing around certain subjects and topics.
And just, I've been practicing a lot of yes and reading the news lately. Therapists love to say yes and. Any given event, 2 truths can be true at the same time. You can take one news story and it can apply to 2 different narratives. It can add fuel to the flames of my leftist narrative over here and my brother's narrative over there. I mean, you take any issue, whether it's ice raids or forest fires, depending on the angle you take or who you sympathize with most in the dynamic, it's all true.
Yeah, gosh, it's reminding me of, was it last year, the LA wildfires? Where
exactly, that came up in News Swap, yeah.
Right, somewhere it was reported that it was exacerbated by climate change.
Yeah, or it's the local government mismanagement.
Yeah. So, okay, let's have a think about the left. You and I both, I think it's no surprise to anybody, we both identify as being more left of center in terms of our political beliefs. Where have we on the left not been very curious?
I think that's, a really important question. I have an answer. Do you remember this photo that came out 8 or 9 years ago? It's on the New York subway, and there's a drag queen seated next to a woman in the niqab, the veil. Do you remember?
Yes.
And it went viral because it had this caption, "This is the future the left wants." Which everyone on the left thought was hilarious because we were all like, yeah. I think, you and I are 2 lefties, and we actually celebrate this photo because we see 2 people who probably have nothing alike, but they're both just riding the subway, not bothering each other, going about their lives. That's the future we want. Now, I think if you added a 3rd person there and they were a conservative Christian, you might get some lefties who bristle at that.
Really? The same principle applies, right? Of there's room for everybody here.
Yeah, but I don't think we practice it in the way we talk about diversity in this country. I think we celebrate diversity if you're a member of a minority, but a lot of us don't hesitate to crap on you if you're part of a majority. And I think a lot of that is because we're trying to educate about privilege. But one thing that came through over and over and over again, talking to my brother, and I can play a clip here where he talks about this, is that as a white, straight Christian male, he doesn't see any room for him. I think a lot of people who don't feel part of like Trump's America are very scared right now. I have a lot of friends who are people of color. When Trump says us and them, they feel like the them. Trans friends who feel like the them, and they don't think they have a part in Trump's America, and it's very scary for them. And I wish there was more empathy for that.
Well, okay. And I mean, the whole us and them thing can be very quickly turned around to Democrats and Republicans. I mean, I felt like the minority for 2 of the last 3 presidents and didn't feel like my values were safe or that I could speak up in certain places because of my beliefs. So I know I'm white. I know it's different. I'd like to think that this is a spectrum, not a black or white, yay or nay type of feeling. But I mean, yeah.
I think a lot of people are going to resonate with that, actually, because, I mean, as you know, I'm interested in topics of equality. And I've had a lot of conversations recently, some of which we've talked on the podcast about, the straight white male experience and how some of the scripts there behind like how men show up in relationships or in dating environments compared to women. And I think there's this huge feeling of like being invalidated among a lot of men, where it feels like, yeah, I get that there's this big thing and we have more privilege and we're in the majority and blah, 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 blah. But like, if you're going to speak to me in this way, or you're going to represent me as like this big monster, then I am like, peace out. Like, I am not engaging in this conversation. And I totally get that. And yet on the other hand, I think what's happening with a lot of women in these conversations, and maybe I can also shed light on where I'm at with this, is there's this like feeling of, but are you recognizing what's at stake here for someone other than yourself, right? Like you're not in the firing line in the same way. So there's almost like both sides are desperate to feel validated of their pain, and both sides don't feel it. So it's not that all women are blaming all men or all men are blaming all women. I think you're led into those kinds of corners, I think, when you feel like the other person can't appreciate the complexities of how you do not feel seen in this situation. And that for me comes back to this feeling of privilege, right? Because I think if you're unable to understand what it feels like for somebody who doesn't live the life that you live, who doesn't have the basic safety when they kick off their day the way that you do, who has to think of like 10 other things on top of the things that you struggle with on an average day, then you can't empathize with that person. You can say you empathize with them, but you can't genuinely, because you haven't grasped the complexity of the situation. And so therefore, perhaps their outrage or their anger might look a little bit disproportionate to you as a result. And therefore you then feel vilified and cornered. And so I think it's this like vicious circle almost that we get stuck in.
Totally. And this is where it gets so tricky. I think all I'm saying, and trying to distill a lot of the sentiment I got from my brother and the conversations we have, all I'm saying is that when we're trying to have these conversations about privilege and trying to get people to empathize a little more with what minorities have to put up with, sometimes we skip the step of saying your experience is also valid. Like your day-to-day struggles, your emotions, your lived reality is valid. And like, I see you are a person who also matters. Now can you understand how I feel like my life and my struggles don't matter? And for so many reasons, I struggle even more, Yeah. And it's just that skipping the step of acknowledging another person's completely valid lived experience that does deepen this resentment and doesn't lay the bridge to have these more complicated conversations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And actually, I recognize how I was there a few years ago, and in many ways, it's why I became a coach, because I recognized that I was at the edges of my own skill set and I needed to kind of grow in some of those spaces to be able to hold space for the lived experience of somebody who I totally disagreed with, and I felt too activated by my own response to be able to really hear them. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is like, can you really hear somebody without holding in your mind the things you want to say in response? Like listening to not respond, but listening to understand is just like a whole different skill altogether.
I think it is a skill that needs to be developed. I love the idea of teaching it more in schools, having people practice it more. I really encourage everyone to look for doable small ways that they can practice that more. It's hard. Like this experiment I did with my brother was hard. And each step along the way, we were both worried that it was going to backfire and actually just drive us further apart,
Yeah, I mean, you hear both of you, but I definitely heard Joe getting very worked up in some parts, like you could see this is taxing as a conversation.
Yeah, we get into some pretty intense debates about misinformation, truth, our responsibility to the truth.
So where are you both now? What has it done to your relationship? How do you feel about your politics? Do you understand each other better?
Yeah. I'd love to say that I've shown him the light and he's suddenly seen the world through different eyes and he understands all of my horror about the Trump administration. I don't think I've really changed his mind about anything, but...
That wasn't the point, I guess.
That wasn't the point. We're talking, though, for the first time ever. We're actually having conversations for the first time ever because politics was never on the table. Since this experiment, we message each other every now and then with a headline and we say, what's your take on this? I'll send him one of Trump's tweets and I'll say, what's your reaction to this? He'll respond and then I'm able to say, thanks for that. You should know that it horrified me for X, Y, Z reason. I felt more emboldened to let him know that I'm just enraged and horrified with some of the crap that's going down. But we're at a place now where I feel comfortable saying it and he feels comfortable hearing it. I guess we've taken the personal out of these conversations, the really heavy emotional buildup, the rage that the polarization is fueling. We've taken that out of the equation and we're actually allowed to just debate these things intellectually.
I'm just reminded of that funny exchange we had the other day where, what was it even about?
Was it Greenland?
Oh, it's the Greenland thing. And I sent it to you and I was like, is this for real? What's actually happening? And
I had asked my brother about it earlier in the day.
What perfect timing. And I said to you, but I don't respect this position. What do I do about that? And your response was...
Respect the right to have an opinion?
Yes. Yes, that is where I had to land.
Yeah, I mean, it's a two-way street that we've established where we're both comfortable with sending each other questions and news articles and listening to each other. And as far as a brother-to-brother level, I think we're just closer than we ever have been.
Yeah.
We just,
that's so nice. It's lifted something between you, right? I mean, huge respect to you. You know this already, but I think it's one of the most innovative and insightful experiments that I've seen for a long time. And I'm just so proud of you for everything you did to set this up and the way that you recorded it. I think this podcast, the New Swap podcast series is amazing. And I think everybody should go listen to it. And if you're like me, you're going to be feeling worked up and outraged and sending really long lists of bullet point notes to Cole at the end of each episode.
Facts.
We'll link it in the episode description here, actually, so people can find it easily. But I think just connecting back to a thing you said earlier, we don't have to be curious, walk around as these curiosity machines. Curiosity is a practice. It's not some kind of virtue that we have to extend to everybody. Sometimes you come across people and you start talking to them about something and then you just stop because you think this isn't going to be a healthy conversation. This person isn't open to hearing different perspectives to their own, there are times where you just got to have healthy boundaries and you've got to think about whether somebody is open to having a curious, intelligent conversation.
If there's no hope for that two-way street, and a lot of times that's going to happen, then it ain't worth the effort, right? And you got to know your limits.
Protect your peace, yeah.
Yep.
And so let's think about the questions that really help us sit with this, right? I think there are a couple that come to mind for me. The first one is, where in your life are you genuinely trying to understand? And what have you already decided you're kind of done listening to? That kind of reflection, I think, is really powerful because it brings awareness to where you might intentionally be turning your curiosity off.
Right. Yeah. Where have you burnt your bridge and just aren't open to hearing any other stories?
Yeah. And having outside perspectives on a belief you hold tightly is never a bad thing. You don't have to change your mind. You can just be informed by what other people think about it.
Yeah, because I don't know if we said enough, but it's also important to know your non-negotiables. Like, I think it's really important to know what you deeply value. I certainly have my non-negotiables. Nyla, you do. But think about all the issues and ideas and topics in the world where you can acknowledge you don't know the full picture, where you might be able to see someone else's perspective.
Yeah, exactly. It's that single story danger again, right? So where can you remind yourself in life about that danger of a single story and bring in just 10% more curiosity to a topic?
You and I say in the sign off every single episode, be a little more curious. And you and I think that's the secret to unlocking serendipity of life, unlocking surprises, learning new things, discovering new things, just that openness. And even, I think we might pride ourselves in open-mindedness on the left side of the political aisle, but where have we unintentionally closed it off? And where is that doing us a disservice and maybe a chance to also have difficult conversations and, call other people in to our side of things? Where have we closed the door on that?
Yeah.
All the stuff we've talked about can be so tricky to discuss. I mean, this entire time I was very, very aware of my privileges as a white male. And I know that at a time when it just feels like a lot of people's civil liberties are being stripped away, it can feel almost perverse when someone is speaking up for the respect and dignity of people who carry a lot of privilege in this world and support what the Trump administration and a lot of far-right movement is doing. But I actually think that's where the way forward is. I also support all the activists on the street condemning all the heinous things that are going on that we've been witnessing day to day. But I also think that it takes the diplomats who have the energy to sit down and have difficult conversations.
Yeah.
It takes a village to get on the other side of this. It takes all sorts. And I'm going to continue practicing this art and this skill of curiosity with my brother and trying to extend it to other relationships in my life.
Yeah, thank you. It really is true that multiple things can be true at the same time, right? And I think
that's it.
It's exactly what you point out. And I often think about the privileges I have as well, and where I can be more curious and where I can extend more growth and learning to. And I think a lot of it comes from being open to having these difficult conversations. And this is why we're here, talking about politics in these situations does still feel really taboo. It feels really difficult. It feels really divisive.
It's one of the most deviant things you can do is try to talk politics with someone who disagrees with you these days.
Right. But I've been really inspired by listening to News Swap. I felt really worked up listening to it as well. And I've always needed a long walk after it. But I
get it.
Yes, I bet. But I'm really glad that you did this experiment. And I learned a lot from seeing what you modeled in those conversations. And I hope other listeners will see that too, because I think that takes a lot of humility and courage and also care to do it that way. So thank you for demonstrating that in your podcast and for giving us all something to think about.
You're very kind. Thanks for that. And just for the record, you were a constant sounding board while I was putting this out into the world. So thanks for giving me the courage to also post it and push through
Yeah,
it.
Thanks for reading all my long bullet pointed messages.
Oh my gosh, I loved them.
Some people hate those.
Bring it on.
So until next time, guys, stay kind, stay curious, and stay just a little bit deviant.
Thank you, everyone. See ya.